I thought I'd seen it all working retail, but nothing prepared me for the night shift at this particular Virginia convenience store. The air was thick with something unsettling, and every customer who walked through those doors seemed to carry a secret or a curse. Join me as I recount the bizarre, terrifying encounters that made me question reality itself. The clock on the wall behind the counter read 2:17 a.m. when I first noticed something was fundamentally wrong with Murphy's Corner Store. I'd been working the graveyard shift for exactly 3 weeks, and each night had been progressively stranger than the last. The fluorescent lights above hummed their electrical lullaby, occasionally flickering in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, as if the store itself was trying to communicate in Morse code. Murphy's sat at the intersection of two forgotten country roads, about 15 miles outside of Farmville, Virginia. During the day, it served truckers, local farmers, and the occasional lost tourist. But at night, it became something else entirely. The parking lot stretched into darkness beyond the reach of our single security light, and the woods that surrounded us on 3 sides seemed to press closer with each passing hour. I had taken this job out of desperation. After losing my position at the bank in Richmond, I moved back to my hometown and needed anything that would pay the bills. The previous night shift worker, Tommy Garrett, had quit without notice, leaving behind only a hastily scribbled note that read, "Can't do it anymore. The rules aren't worth it." When I asked my manager, Dale Murphy, about these mysterious rules, he'd handed me a laminated sheet with a nervous laugh. "Just some quirky guidelines Tommy came up with," Dale had said, avoiding my eyes. "Probably doesn't mean much, but might as well follow them. You know how it is with night shifts. Gets lonely, makes you paranoid." The rules were indeed bizarre. Don't acknowledge the figure in aisle 3 after 3 a.m. Always count your register twice if a customer pays in old coins. If someone asks for directions to Millbrook Cemetery, tell them to burn down in 1987. Never turn off the radio in the back office, even if it's just static. And strangest of all, if a customer's reflection doesn't match their appearance, act like everything is normal and wait for them to leave. I'd laughed at the absurdity of it all, stuffing the rule sheet into my pocket and forgetting about it. That was my first mistake. The store felt different at night. The familiar aisles of chips and sodas took on an ominous quality under the harsh fluorescent lighting. Shadows seemed deeper, and the security cameras that watched every corner felt more like they were protecting me from something inside, rather than keeping thieves out. The soft drink coolers hummed constantly, a low, droning sound that made my teeth ache after hours of exposure. It was during my second week that I encountered my first truly unsettling customer. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 2:30 a.m., and in walked a woman who couldn't have been older than 30. She wore a floral dress that looked like it belonged in the 1950s, complete with a small purse clutched in white-gloved hands. Her hair was perfectly styled in victory rolls, and her makeup was flawless despite the late hour. What disturbed me wasn't her appearance. Virginia had plenty of folks who enjoyed vintage fashion. It was her absolute stillness. She moved through the store without making a sound, her footsteps completely silent on the linoleum floor. When she approached the counter, she maintained perfect eye contact, never blinking, never looking away. Her smile never wavered, frozen in place like a painted doll. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying a strange accent I couldn't place. "I'll take a pack of Lucky Strikes, please." I turned to the cigarette display, scanning for the familiar red and white package. "I'm sorry, we don't carry Lucky Strikes. Would you like to try something else?" When I turned back, her smile had faded completely. Her eyes, which had seemed brown in the fluorescent light, now appeared completely black. "That's unfortunate," she said, placing a crisp $20 bill on the counter. The bill looked old, older than any currency I'd seen in circulation. "Perhaps next time." She turned and walked toward the door with that same eerie silence. I picked up the 20 to examine it closer and felt my blood run cold. The date read 1952, and the bill felt different, thicker, heavier than modern currency. By the time I looked up, she was gone, and the parking lot was empty. But here's what really made my skin crawl. When I checked the security footage the next morning, there was no record of anyone entering or leaving the store between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. The timestamp showed me standing alone, apparently talking to empty air and handling money that materialized from nowhere. That's when I pulled out Tommy's rules and read them again, this time with growing dread rather than amusement. The following night brought its own horrors. I'd barely settled into my routine when I noticed him. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the parking lot light, perfectly still among the shadows. At first, I thought it might be someone having car trouble, so I stepped outside to offer help. "Everything okay out here?" I called into the darkness. The figure didn't respond, but I could feel eyes watching me. The sensation was so intense it made my skin crawl, like insects marching across my flesh. I retreated back into the store, locking the door behind me despite the fact that we were supposed to stay open 24 hours. Throughout the night, I found myself glancing toward the windows, and each time, the figure was still there, never moving, never approaching, just watching. The worst part was that I couldn't make out any features. It was as if someone had cut a human-shaped hole in the darkness itself. By 4 a.m., when my replacement arrived, the figure was gone. I mentioned it to Janet, the morning shift worker, but she just shrugged it off. "Probably just someone waiting for a ride," she said. But when I checked the security footage, it showed the parking lot completely empty all night. Just like the woman with the vintage dress, my mysterious watcher existed only in my memory. The third week was when things escalated beyond mere, unsettling encounters. I'd grown accustomed to the store's odd atmosphere, even started to find comfort in its predictable strangeness. The flickering lights no longer bothered me, and I'd learned to ignore the soft sounds that came from the back office. Footsteps that had no source, papers rustling when no one was there, and occasionally, what sounded like whispered conversations. It was Thursday night when she walked in, an elderly woman with wild gray hair and clothes that hung on her tiny frame like scarecrow rags. She moved with purpose, heading straight to the counter without browsing the aisles. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her voice surprisingly strong despite her frail appearance. "Could you tell me how to get to Millbrook Cemetery? I'm supposed to meet someone there." My hand instinctively went to the rule sheet in my pocket, and I recited the prescribed response. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but Millbrook Cemetery burned down in 1987. Her reaction was immediate and terrifying. Her eyes widened with what looked like panic, and she began backing toward the door. No, that can't be right. I was just there yesterday. The headstones, the iron gates, everything was perfect. I'm afraid not, ma'am. Been gone for decades now." She stopped backing away and fixed me with a stare that seemed to pierce right through me. "What year is it, boy?" 2024, ma'am." The color drained from her already pale face, and she let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. Then she was gone, moving faster than her aged body should have been capable of. The door chime echoed in the empty store, and I was alone again. But the encounter left me shaken in a way the others hadn't. There had been genuine terror in her reaction, real confusion and fear. Whatever was happening here wasn't just strange, it was tragic. These weren't just bizarre customers. They were people caught between worlds, lost in time, searching for places and people that no longer existed. As dawn approached and the first hints of sunlight began to creep through the windows, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Instead of quitting like Tommy had, instead of running from whatever forces were at work at Murphy's Corner Store, I decided to stay. I needed to understand what was happening, needed to help these lost souls if I could. Looking back now, I realized that decision marked the moment I stopped being a casual observer of the supernatural and became an active participant in something far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The store had chosen me, just as it had chosen Tommy before me, and countless others before him. And deep down, in a part of my mind I tried to keep locked away, I suspected that once Murphy's Corner store chose you, it never really let you go. The 4th week of my employment at Murphy's Corner store brought a realization that chilled me to the bone. I was developing regulars. Not the normal kind you'd expect at a 24-hour convenience store. Not insomniacs grabbing energy drinks or shift workers stopping for coffee. These were customers who existed in the liminal space between midnight and dawn, drawn to our little store like moths to a flame they couldn't resist. I'd started keeping a journal, documenting each encounter with obsessive detail. Dale had installed new security cameras after I'd mentioned the footage gaps. But somehow, these particular customers never appeared on the recordings. It was as if the store itself was protecting them, hiding their existence from the outside world while allowing them to interact with me in ways that defied explanation. The silent observer became my most consistent visitor. Every night, at exactly 11:47 p.m., the figure would appear in the parking lot, taking up the same position in the shadows beyond the security light. I'd grown oddly comfortable with its presence, even started nodding in acknowledgement when I stepped outside for breaks. The figure never responded, but I swear I could feel a sense of gratitude, understanding. It was hard to put into words. One particularly foggy October night, I decided to break protocol, armed with a heavy-duty flashlight. I walked directly toward the figure, determined to finally see who or what had been watching me for weeks. "I know you're there," I called out, my voice swallowed by the thick mist. "I'm not afraid anymore. I just want to understand." The beam of my flashlight cut through the fog, revealing absolutely nothing. But the feeling of being watched intensified, and I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from directly in front of me. Yet my light revealed only empty air. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, listening to the rhythmic breathing of something invisible. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The oppressive feeling of being observed lifted, and I knew, without looking, that I was alone in the parking lot. When I returned to the store, I found a single black rose lying on the counter where I'd been standing. It was perfectly fresh, with droplets of dew still clinging to its petals. There was no card, no explanation, just a flower and the lingering scent of earth and old perfume. The lost traveler arrived 3 nights later, and his visit shook me more than any of the previous encounters. He appeared to be in his 30s, wearing a well-tailored suit that looked expensive but somehow wrong. The cut was slightly off, the fabric had an odd sheen, and the whole ensemble gave the impression of someone trying to dress modern but failing to understand the current style. He approached the counter with a confused expression, constantly glancing around as if nothing made sense to him. When he spoke, his accent was distinctly Southern but flavored with pronunciations that sounded archaic, like he'd learned English from very old books. "Pardon me, sir," he said, removing a hat that wasn't quite a fedora, but wasn't quite a bowler either. "I seem to have taken a wrong turn somewhere. Could you direct me to the nearest telegraph office?" I blinked, certain I misheard. "I'm sorry. Did you say telegraph office?" His confusion deepened. "Yes, of course. I need to send word to my business partner in Richmond that I'll be delayed. The roads are in terrible condition. My automobile broke down about 5 miles back. Sir, there haven't been telegraph offices for, well, decades. Do you have a cell phone? I could help you call someone." He stared at me blankly. "Cell phone? I'm afraid I don't understand." I pulled out my smartphone and showed it to him. His reaction was immediate and violent. He stumbled backward, knocking over a display of candy bars, his face pale with terror. "Witchcraft," he whispered, making the sign of the cross. "What manner of devil's device is that?" Before I could respond, he was backing toward the door, never taking his eyes off my phone. "What year is this place? What has become of the world?" It's 2024, sir. October 15th, 2024. He let out a sound of pure anguish and fled into the night. I found his hat on the floor where he dropped it, and when I examined it closely, I discovered a label inside. Thalheimer's Department Store, Richmond, Virginia, 1923. But it was the cryptic note passer who would prove to be the most unsettling of my regular customers. She first appeared on a Tuesday night, seemingly normal except for the intensity of her gaze. She was middle-aged, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and wearing jeans and a cardigan that could have come from any department store. She purchased a bottle of water and a pack of gum. Nothing unusual. But as I handed her the change, she pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm along with the coins. "Don't read this until after I leave," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "And remember, knowledge is a burden you can never put down." The moment she stepped outside, I unfolded the paper. Written in beautiful, flowing script were the words, "The store remembers everything. Every soul that passes through leaves a mark. You're not the first to work nights here, and you won't be the last. But you might be the first to understand what it really wants." I looked up to see where she'd gone, but the parking lot was empty. The security footage showed me talking to empty air and apparently writing the note myself, though I had no memory of doing so. She returned the following week with another note. "They're not customers. They're echoes. Imprints of people who died with unfinished business. The store sits on a crossroads, not just of highways, but of worlds." Week after week, she appeared with new revelations. The notes revealed that Murphy's Corner store had been built on the site of an old coaching and that had burned down in 1887, killing 17 people. Before that, it had been a trading post where settlers had made deals with local Native American tribes. And before that, a sacred burial ground. "The land remembers," one note explained, and the store feeds on that memory, drawing the lost and the forgotten. "You've been chosen as a keeper, a guardian between worlds." The previous night workers understood this, even if they couldn't handle it. I began to research the history of the land, spending my days at the local library poring over old newspapers and county records. What I discovered made the note's claims even more disturbing. Murphy's Corner store was indeed built on a site with a dark history. Not just the coaching and fire, but multiple tragedies stretching back centuries. In 1912, a family of 5 had been murdered in their farmhouse that once stood where a parking lot now sat. In 1954, a school bus had crashed at the intersection during a winter storm, killing 8 children. In 1978, a young couple had been found dead in their car in the exact spot where my silent observer now stood each night, victims of what police had ruled a murder-suicide, but locals whispered was something far more sinister. The pattern was clear. Every few decades, something terrible happened at this crossroads. And now I was part of that pattern, chosen to serve as some sort of bridge between the living and the dead. The woman with the notes appeared one last time, but this visit was different. Instead of her usual calm demeanor, she seemed agitated, desperate. "They're getting stronger," she said, pressing not 1 but 3 notes into my hand. "The barrier is weakening. More of them are coming through, and they're staying longer. You need to understand the rules aren't just guidelines. They're protection spells, ways to keep the balance." Her final notes were warnings. "Never acknowledge the figure in aisle 3 after 3 a.m. because that's when the veil is thinnest, and recognition gives spirits power over the living. Count your register twice if someone pays in old coins because that money comes from beyond. And if you don't balance it properly, you invite them to stay." The radio in the back office isn't playing music. It's playing frequencies that keep the truly dangerous things away. The last note was the most chilling. You're not just working here anymore. You're becoming part of this place. The store is changing you, making you into something that can better serve its needs. Soon, you'll understand why the previous workers all quit, or why some of them never really left at all. I looked up to thank her, to ask her name, to demand more answers, but she was already walking toward the door. This time, however, she didn't disappear immediately. Instead, she turned back with a sad smile. "My name was Rebecca Morrison," she said. "I worked the night shift here in 1987. I've been trying to warn every keeper since then, but you're the first one who's actually listened." She stepped into the night, and this time, I watched her fade away like morning mist, becoming transparent until there was nothing left but the echo of her voice and the weight of her warnings in my pocket. As I stood alone in the fluorescent-lit store, surrounded by the familiar hum of coolers and the distant static from the back office radio, I realized I had a choice to make. I could quit, like Tommy had, like presumably every night worker before him, or I could stay and accept whatever transformation was happening to me, becoming another keeper in a long line of guardians protecting the boundary between worlds. The decision, I knew, would define not just my future, but possibly my very soul. By my 6th week at Murphy's Corner Store, I had stopped questioning whether the supernatural events were real. The evidence was overwhelming, and my skepticism had been replaced by a grim acceptance of my role as a guardian between worlds. What I hadn't prepared for was how the store itself would begin to reveal its true nature, speaking to me through phenomena that defied every logical explanation I'd ever relied upon. The paranormal activity started small. Items falling from shelves with no apparent cause, doors creaking open when I was certain I'd closed them, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. At first, I attributed these incidents to the building's age or my sleep-deprived imagination. But as the occurrences became more frequent and more purposeful, I realized the store was trying to communicate with me. The first truly undeniable manifestation happened during my 7th Tuesday shift. I was restocking the chip aisle around 3:30 a.m. when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking in the back office. Heavy footsteps paced back and forth across the floor, accompanied by the scraping of a chair being moved and papers rustling. Since I was the only person in the building, I grabbed the baseball bat Dale kept behind the counter and cautiously made my way toward the office. The sounds grew louder as I approached, but the moment I touched the door handle, everything went silent. When I pushed the door open, I found the office exactly as I'd left it. Chairs in place, papers organized, no sign of disturbance. But the air was thick with the scent of pipe tobacco, and on the desk sat a ledger I'd never seen before. The ledger's pages were yellowed with age, and the entries were written in various hands, dating back to 1889. It was a record of the night workers, name after name, with start dates and end dates. But what made my blood run cold were the notes beside many of the entries. Quit after 3 weeks. Couldn't handle the visitors. Left town suddenly. Never returned. Found wandering Route 15. No memory of last 6 months. Disappeared. Family still searching. My name was already in the ledger. Written in my own handwriting, though. I had no memory of making the entry. Below it, in a different pen, someone had written, "Shows promise. Maybe the one we've been waiting for." I slammed the ledger shut and backed out of the office. But when I returned 5 minutes later with my phone to take pictures, the book was gone. The tobacco smell lingered for hours, and I swear I could hear quiet chuckling coming from the air vents. The electrical disturbances began the following night. It started with the fluorescent lights developing a stutter, flickering in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code. I tried to decode the sequences, but they were too irregular to make sense. Then the cash register began acting up, randomly opening with loud dings and displaying error messages I had never seen before. But it was the radio in the back office that provided the most unsettling evidence of the store's supernatural nature. Dale had been explicit that the radio should never be turned off. "It keeps the atmosphere right," he'd said, though his nervous laugh suggested he knew more than he was telling. The radio was tuned to an oldies station, but after midnight, the signal would fade to static. Except the static wasn't random. If I listened carefully, I could hear voices buried in the white noise, conversations in languages I didn't recognize, sobbing that made my heart ache, and occasionally, clear words that seemed directed at me personally. "He's listening now," came through the static one night, clear as if someone was standing next to the radio. "Good," replied another voice. "We've been waiting so long for someone who could hear us." "Will he help us?" asked a third voice, younger, more desperate. "He has to," said the first voice. "He's one of us now." I tried adjusting the tuning, but no matter where I set the dial, the voices followed. They seemed to know when I was paying attention, growing louder and more insistent when I focused on their words. Sometimes they would give me warnings. "Don't go in aisle 3 tonight, he's angry." Other times they shared stories. "I died in the fire, but I can't leave. The smoke is still in my lungs." One voice became familiar. A woman who identified herself as Helen, the keeper from 1967 to 1969. She died in a car accident on her way to work one snowy December morning, but part of her had remained tied to the store. "You feel it, don't you?" Helen's voice crackled through the static. "The pull, the way the store makes you feel needed, important. That's how it keeps us. It makes us believe we're protecting something precious, but really, we're just feeding it." "Feeding it what?" I asked the empty office. "Our life force, our sanity, our connection to the living world. The longer you stay, the more you belong to it instead of yourself." The cold spot that Rebecca had mentioned in her notes manifested near the end of my 7th week. It was located in aisle 3, right where the rules warn me never to acknowledge anything after 3 a.m. The temperature drop was dramatic, from the store's normal 72 degrees to what felt like below freezing, all contained within a roughly 6-foot circular area. My breath would fog when I walked through that section, and frost would sometimes form on the products. But more disturbing than the temperature was the feeling of overwhelming sadness that accompanied the cold. Standing in that spot, I was flooded with emotions that weren't my own: grief, anger, regret, and a desperate longing that made me want to weep. I started avoiding aisle 3 altogether, but the cold spot began to expand. Each night, it grew larger, and the emotional impact became stronger. Soon, I could feel its influence from the counter, a constant psychic weight that left me drained and melancholy. It was during my 8th week that I first saw him, the figure I was forbidden to acknowledge. I was doing my nightly inventory when movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention. Standing in aisle 3, partially hidden by the shadows between the fluorescent lights, was a man in his 50s. He wore a charred, tattered uniform that might have once been a gas station attendant's outfit, and his skin looked burned, peeling in places to reveal dark meat underneath. He was staring directly at me, with eyes that held an intelligence and desperation that made my chest tight with sympathy. His mouth moved as if he was trying to speak, but no sound reached me. When I started to turn my head for a better look, I remembered the rule just in time and forced myself to continue my inventory as if nothing was happening. For the next hour, I felt his presence following me around the store. He stayed just out of direct sight, but I could sense his frustration growing as I refused to acknowledge him. Objects began falling from shelves wherever he lingered, cans rolling across the floor, magazines sliding from their racks, bags of chips bursting open for no reason. The activity reached a crescendo when every light in the store began strobing rapidly, and the temperature dropped so dramatically that ice formed on the windows. Through it all, I maintained my resolve, following Rebecca's warning that acknowledgement gave spirits power over the living. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The lights steadied, the temperature normalized, and the oppressive presence vanished. When I finally allowed myself to look toward aisle 3, it was empty, but written in the frost on the cooler door were 2 words: "Help me." The whispers became a constant presence after that night. I heard them in the hum of the refrigerators, in the buzz of the fluorescent lights, and the rustle of product packaging. They were always there, a susurrus of desperate voices trying to communicate needs I couldn't understand. Some nights, the voices would organize themselves into what sounded like a choir, harmonizing in melodies that were hauntingly beautiful but deeply melancholy. Other nights, they would argue among themselves, disagreeing about something I couldn't quite grasp, but that seemed vitally important to them. The most disturbing whispers came from the air vents, children's voices, high and clear, singing nursery rhymes that grew progressively darker with each verse. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes we all fall down, would transform into something sinister about graves and bones and eternal darkness. I began to understand that Murphy's Corner Store wasn't just built on cursed ground. It was a collection point for souls who had died with unfinished business. The building itself had become a supernatural prison, holding spirits who couldn't move on, but couldn't truly live either. And somehow, through mechanisms I didn't fully comprehend, I had become their keeper, their only connection to the world of the living. But Helen's warnings through the radio static were becoming more urgent. You're changing, becoming more like us and less like them. Soon you won't be able to leave, even if you want to. The store is making you into what it needs, a permanent guardian who can see both worlds. As I stood in the flickering light of Murphy's Corner Store, surrounded by whispers of the dead and feeling the cold touch of otherworldly fingers brushing against my skin, I realized that my transformation was accelerating. Each night, I felt less connected to my daytime life and more attuned to the needs of the spirits who called this place home. The question was no longer whether I could help them find peace. It was whether I could do so before I joined them permanently in their endless vigil between worlds. The 9th week marked a turning point in my supernatural education at Murphy's Corner Store. What had begun as strange encounters and unexplained phenomena evolved into something far more personal and threatening. The store was no longer content to merely show me its secrets. It wanted me to become an active participant in whatever dark purpose it served. The changes in my reflection started subtly. I'd catch glimpses of myself in the security mirrors positioned throughout the store and notice small discrepancies. My shirt would appear a different color. My hair would look longer or shorter. Sometimes I'd seem to be wearing clothing I didn't own. At first, I attributed these inconsistencies to the mirror's poor quality and the strange lighting effects that plagued the store after midnight. But as the differences became more pronounced, I could no longer deny that something fundamental was wrong. One night, while cleaning the coffee station, I glanced up at the convex security mirror mounted above the counter and saw myself wearing a uniform I didn't recognize. A brown shirt with Murphy's Corner Store embroidered across the chest, but the logo was different, older, and my face looked gaunt and hollow-eyed, as if I hadn't slept in weeks. I spun around to look at my actual reflection in the window, and there I was in my normal clothes, looking tired but otherwise ordinary. When I turned back to the security mirror, it showed my correct appearance again, but for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw disappointment in my reflected eyes. The phenomenon escalated rapidly. Some nights, my reflection would lag behind my movements by several seconds, creating an unsettling disconnect between my actions and their mirror image. Other times, my reflection would move independently, turning its head to look at things that weren't there or making gestures I wasn't making. The most disturbing incident occurred during my 10th week. I was restocking energy drinks in the cooler when I caught my reflection in the glass door. But it wasn't me. It was Rebecca Morrison, the woman who had passed me the cryptic notes. She was wearing the same Murphy's Corner Store uniform I'd seen in the security mirror, and she was frantically trying to communicate something. Her mouth moved urgently, but no sound penetrated the glass. She pointed repeatedly toward the back office, then mummed writing something down. When I blinked, my own reflection was back, looking confused and frightened, emotions that perfectly matched what I was feeling. I found myself drawn to the back office more frequently, searching for whatever Rebecca's reflection had been trying to show me. It was there that I discovered a hidden compartment behind a loose panel in the wall. Inside was another ledger, older than the first one I'd found, containing entries that dated back to the coaching and that had burned down in 1887. This ledger wasn't just a record of employees. It was a catalog of the store's supernatural residents. Each spirit was meticulously documented. Their name, how they died, what kept them tethered to the location, and most chillingly, their level of influence over the living world. The burn man from aisle 3 was identified as Walter Grimm, who had died in the coaching and fire while trying to save other guests. His entry noted, "Seeks acknowledgement and assistance in moving on. Grows more powerful with attention. Extremely dangerous if recognized. Can possess weak-willed individuals." My silent observer in the parking lot was listed as James Crawford, a stagecoach driver who had been murdered by highwaymen in 1894 while defending his passengers. His entry read, "Protective spirit, watches over night workers. Harmless but persistent. Gratitude manifestations include small gifts and warnings of immediate danger." Page after page detailed the supernatural residents of Murphy's Corner Store, and at the back of the ledger, I found a section titled The Keepers. It was a record of every night worker who had served in my position, going back over a century. Some entries were brief, lasted 3 weeks, quit after minor possession incident. Others were more detailed. Excellent sensitivity to supernatural phenomena. Served faithfully for 2 years before voluntary transition to permanent guardian status. The final entry made my blood run cold. Thomas Garrett. Shows exceptional potential for keeper role. Voluntary departure suggests outside interference. Must be replaced quickly to maintain balance. Below Tommy's entry, in handwriting I was beginning to recognize as my own, were notes I had no memory of writing. Replacement keeper adapting well to role. Strong supernatural sensitivity developing. Recommend acceleration of integration process. I slammed the ledger shut and stumbled out of the office, but I couldn't escape the implications of what I'd read. Somehow, while I slept during the day or during quiet moments at work, I was documenting my own transformation into something I didn't understand. The phone call started the following night. The store's old rotary phone would ring at random intervals, always during the quietest hours between 3 and 4 a.m. When I answered, sometimes there was nothing but static. Other times, I heard distant voices having conversations that seemed to come from different time periods. "The railroad's coming through next spring," said one voice, crackling with a poor connection. "Going to change everything around here." "That's wonderful news, Henry," replied another voice. "Maybe it'll bring more business to the inn." But occasionally, the call seemed directed at me personally. A woman's voice, clear despite the static interference, would ask, "Are you ready yet? The store needs you to be ready." "Ready for what?" I'd respond, but the line would go dead before I received an answer. The most disturbing call came during my 11th week. The phone rang at exactly 3:33 a.m., and when I picked it up, I heard my own voice. "Don't trust what you're becoming," my voice said through the static. "Fight it while you still can. The store is feeding on your humanity, replacing it with something else. You have maybe 2 weeks before the change is irreversible." "Who is this?" I demanded, even though the voice was unmistakably mine. "I'm what you could become if you let this continue. I'm calling from a time that hasn't happened yet, trying to warn a version of myself that might still be saved." The line crackled with interference, and my future self's voice became urgent, desperate. "Look for the emergency protocol in the third ledger. It's hidden in the foundation of the building, beneath the loose stone behind the ice machine. But remember, using it means sacrificing everything the store has collected. All the spirits will be released at once, and the psychic backlash could kill you." The call ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the silent phone with trembling hands. The possibility that I was somehow speaking to a future version of myself opened terrifying questions about the nature of time and reality at Murphy's Corner store. I spent the rest of that shift searching behind the ice machine, and sure enough, I found a loose stone that revealed a small cavity in the foundation. Inside was a third ledger, its pages bound in what looked like human skin and written in multiple languages, some of which I couldn't identify. The emergency protocol was written in English on the final page, and reading it filled me with a dread so profound I nearly vomited. The procedure required the keeper to willingly offer their life force to break the supernatural bonds holding all the spirits to the store. It would release every soul trapped there, potentially dozens of entities spanning over a century, all at once. But what made the protocol truly horrifying was the final line. Warning, the keeper performing this ritual will become the anchor point for the release. Their soul will be consumed in the process, ensuring they can never find peace in any realm. As I closed the ledger and returned it to its hiding place, I realized the store was giving me a choice. But it was a choice between damnation and transformation into something inhuman. The final interaction that would force my hand came 3 nights later. I was doing my usual midnight inventory when a customer walked in who made every supernatural encounter I'd experienced pale in comparison. She appeared to be in her 20s, with long dark hair and wearing a simple white dress. But there was something fundamentally wrong with her presence. Her footsteps echoed strangely, as if she were walking on hollow ground rather than linoleum. The temperature dropped noticeably as she moved through the store, and the fluorescent lights dimmed wherever she went. Most disturbing of all, she cast no reflection in any of the mirrors or glass surfaces. She approached the counter with a smile that was too wide, revealing teeth that were perfectly straight and unnaturally white. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "You're the new keeper," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I've been waiting to meet you. My name is Catherine Vale, and I died in this very spot in 1954. I try to remain calm, but every instinct I had was screaming that this entity was different from the others, more powerful, more dangerous. What do you want?" Her smile widened further, and I noticed that her eyes were completely black, like pools of oil. "I want what we all want, freedom. But I also want something else. I want you to understand the true purpose of this place." Without waiting for a response, she began to speak, and as her words filled the store, the walls themselves seemed to pulse with a malevolent heartbeat. "This isn't a prison," she said. "It's a factory. Every soul that gets trapped here feeds energy into something much larger, much older than you can imagine. We're not just lost spirits. We're fuel for an entity that exists between dimensions, and it's been growing stronger for over a century." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. All my assumptions about helping trapped souls find peace crumbled as I realized the truth. Murphy's Corner store wasn't a way station for the dead. It was a feeding ground for something cosmic and malevolent. "The keepers aren't guardians," Catherine continued, her voice now coming from the walls, the ceiling, everywhere at once. "They're shepherds, making sure the harvest continues. And you, dear keeper, are about to become the most valuable addition to our collection." I felt something fundamental shift in my perception, as if scales were falling from my eyes. The store's true nature revealed itself to me in all its horror. Every spirit trapped here was slowly being drained of their essence, their very existence converted into sustenance for the dimensional parasite that had been feeding here since the first tragedy occurred on this cursed ground. "But here's the beautiful part," Catherine whispered, now standing directly behind me though I hadn't seen her move. "You still have a choice. You can accept your role willingly and retain some small measure of consciousness even after the transformation. Or you can fight it and be consumed anyway, but with the added suffering of knowing you could have made it easier on yourself." I turned to face her, but she was already fading, becoming translucent like morning mist. Her final words echoed through the store as she vanished completely. You have until dawn to decide. After that, the choice will be made for you. Standing alone in the fluorescent lit store, surrounded by the whispers of dozens of trapped souls, and feeling the weight of cosmic hunger pressing down on me, I realized that my time as a normal human being was measured in hours, not days. The emergency protocol hidden behind the ice machine suddenly seemed less like suicide and more like the only chance for redemption left to me. If I could free all the spirits at once, if I could starve the dimensional parasite of its food source, maybe I could prevent other innocent people from suffering my fate. But as I reached for the hidden ledger, I felt the store's attention focus on me like a searchlight of malevolent intelligence. It knew what I was planning, and it was not pleased. The real battle for my soul was about to begin. The final night of my transformation began like any other, but I could feel the weight of destiny pressing down on me like a physical force. Catherine Vale's ultimatum echoed in my mind as I went through the motions of my usual routine, knowing that every mundane action might be my last as a free-willed human being. I had spent the previous day researching the emergency protocol, deciphering the foreign language passages in the third ledger with the help of online translation tools. What I discovered made the procedure even more terrifying than I'd initially realized. The ritual wouldn't just release the trapped spirits. It would create a massive psychic explosion that could potentially tear open the barrier between dimensions permanently. But as I watched the clock creep toward midnight, I knew I couldn't allow myself to become another collector of souls for the dimensional parasite. Whatever the cost, I had to try to break the cycle that had been feeding on human misery for over a century. The store seemed to sense my resolution. As the hour grew later, the supernatural activity escalated beyond anything I'd experienced before. Every light fixture strobed with epileptic intensity. The temperature fluctuated wildly between freezing cold and stifling heat, and the whispers of the trapped spirits rose to a cacophony of desperate voices, all speaking at once. "Don't do it," pleaded Helen's voice through the radio static. "You don't understand what you'll unleash. Some of us have been here so long we've forgotten how to exist anywhere else." "He has to try," argued another voice I recognized as Rebecca Morrison. "We can't let this continue forever. How many more keepers will we watch get consumed?" "The keeper is ours now," rumbled a deeper voice that seemed to come from the building's foundation itself. "The transformation has already begun. Resistance is futile and will only increase the suffering." I ignored all of them and retrieved the third ledger from its hiding place. The emergency protocol required specific preparations that had to be completed during the witching hour, the time between 3 and 4 a.m. when the barrier between worlds was thinnest. First, I had to draw symbols on every mirror and reflective surface in the store using a mixture of salt, iron filings, and my own blood. The symbols were unlike anything I'd seen before, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly and seemed to writhe and shift when viewed peripherally. As I worked, the store fought back with increasing desperation. Products flew from the shelves, striking me with bruising force. The cash register opened and closed repeatedly, chiming like a discordant bell tower. The cooler's compressors roared like enraged beasts, and the fluorescent lights flickered in Morse code patterns that spelled out threats in multiple languages. But it was the spirits themselves who provided the most resistance. Walter Grimm, the burned man from aisle 3, materialized fully for the first time, his charred flesh smoking in the cold air. He blocked my path to the final mirror, his ruined face twisted with desperation. "You don't understand," he gasped through damaged vocal cords. "If you release us all at once, we'll tear this reality apart. Hundreds of souls, all carrying the psychic weight of violent deaths, suddenly freed from their anchors. It will create a supernatural shockwave that could affect hundreds of miles. I met his burning gaze with as much compassion as I could muster. Then maybe it's time for this reality to be changed. How many more people will suffer if I do nothing? He stepped aside reluctantly, and I completed the symbol on the final mirror. The moment I finished, every reflective surface in the store began to glow with an otherworldly light that cast no shadows, but somehow made everything seem simultaneously brighter and darker. The second phase of the protocol required me to recite an incantation in what the ledger identified as the first language, a tongue that predated human speech but somehow felt familiar in my mouth. As I spoke the ancient words, reality began to warp around me. The store stretched and contracted like a living thing, its walls breathing with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The floor beneath my feet became transparent, revealing layer upon layer of previous buildings. The coaching inn, the trading post, even older structures that might have been built by the original inhabitants of this land. I could see the dimensional parasite now, a massive, writhing thing of shadow and hunger that existed partially in our reality and partially in spaces between spaces. It had been feeding here for centuries, growing stronger with each soul it consumed, and I realized with mounting horror that Murphy's Corner Store was just one of many feeding locations it had established across the world. The creature became aware of my perception and turned its attention toward me with the force of a hurricane. I felt my consciousness being invaded by something so alien and vast that my human mind could barely process its existence. It showed me visions of other stores, other keepers, an entire network of supernatural feeding grounds that stretched across continents and possibly across realities. You cannot stop us. The entity communicated through pure thought, bypassing language entirely. We are eternal, inevitable. Your species' capacity for suffering makes you perfect livestock. This one location can be sacrificed if necessary. We have thousands of others. But even as the creature tried to crush my will with its cosmic indifference, I pressed forward with the final phase of the ritual. Using a knife I'd blessed with holy water from 3 different churches, I carved the ultimate symbol into my own palm, a design that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human geometry should allow. My blood, now mixed with salt and iron, began to glow with the same ethereal light as the mirrors. As each drop hit the floor, it created ripples in reality itself, and I felt the bonds holding every spirit to this location beginning to weaken. The release, when it came, was beyond anything I could have imagined. Dozens of souls, some trapped for over a century, suddenly found themselves free of their supernatural anchors. But instead of disappearing peacefully, they erupted outward in a psychic explosion that shattered the barriers between dimensions. The store filled with brilliant light as spirits raced through walls, ceiling, and floor, carrying with them the accumulated anguish and trauma of their deaths. I felt each one pass through me, their memories and emotions flooding my consciousness with intensity that should have killed me instantly. I experienced Walter Grimm's terror as flames consumed the coaching inn around him. I felt the confusion and fear of the children who died in the school bus crash. I lived through the despair of every keeper who had slowly lost their humanity to this place. All of it poured through me at once, using my soul as a conduit for their escape from the dimensional parasite's influence. The creature's roar of rage and hunger shook the building to its foundations. Cracks appeared in the walls, spreading outward like a spider web, and I realized the entire structure was beginning to collapse. But more importantly, I could feel the entity's connection to this location severing as its food source disappeared. As the last spirit passed through me and fled into whatever realm awaited them, I felt my own essence beginning to unravel. The ritual had worked exactly as the protocol had warned. I was becoming the anchor point for the release, my life force burning away to fuel the freedom of dozens of trapped souls. But in those final moments, as my vision dimmed and my consciousness began to fragment, I heard something that made the sacrifice worthwhile: silence. For the first time since I'd started working at Murphy's Corner Store, there were no whispers, no supernatural presence, no feeling of being watched by hungry entities from beyond the veil. The dimensional parasite was retreating, its connection to this location severed, at least temporarily, and every soul that had been trapped here was finally free to move on to whatever came next. I collapsed to the floor as the sun began to rise through the cracked windows, casting natural light into a space that had been dominated by supernatural darkness for over a century. My reflection in the broken mirrors showed a man who looked far older than his years, with white hair and eyes that held depths they hadn't possessed weeks earlier. Dale Murphy found me unconscious when he arrived to open the store that morning. The official story was that I'd suffered some sort of breakdown. The building had been damaged by what investigators ruled was a minor earthquake, and I was found raving about spirits and dimensional parasites. I was hospitalized for psychological evaluation and eventually released with a diagnosis of work-related stress psychosis. But I knew the truth. I had succeeded in freeing the trapped souls, even if it had cost me most of my sanity and all of my normal human existence. The store was rebuilt within 6 months, but it never reopened. Dale claimed he'd lost his lease, but I suspected he knew more about what had really happened than he'd ever admit. As for me, I found that the ritual had changed me in ways that went beyond the obvious. I could see things that others couldn't, spirits who hadn't yet found their way to whatever came next, dimensional weak points where reality grew thin, and most importantly, other feeding locations like the one I destroyed. I discovered that the dimensional parasite hadn't been eliminated, merely inconvenienced. It had dozens, possibly hundreds of other feeding grounds scattered across the world, each one staffed by unwitting keepers who thought they were protecting or helping supernatural entities when they were actually facilitating a cosmic harvesting operation. So, I made a choice that would define the rest of my existence. Instead of trying to return to my normal life, instead of pretending that what I'd experienced hadn't been real, I decided to hunt them down. Every store, every location where the dimensional parasite had established a foothold, every keeper who was walking the same path I had walked. Some I was able to warn in time, convincing them to flee before the transformation became irreversible. Others had to be stopped by more direct means when they'd already been too deeply corrupted by their supernatural role. In a few locations I destroyed entirely, performing modified versions of the emergency protocol that freed the trapped spirits without requiring my own death. It's been 3 years since that final night at Murphy's Corner Store, and I've closed down 17 feeding locations across the eastern United States. Each victory costs me more of my humanity, and I can feel myself changing into something that exists more in the supernatural realm than the natural one. But every time I free a group of trapped spirits, every time I prevent another innocent person from becoming a keeper, I hear an echo of that blessed silence I experienced in my final moments at Murphy's. It reminds me that some sacrifices are worth making, even if the cost is everything you once believed yourself to be. The dimensional parasite is still out there, still feeding, still establishing new locations wherever tragedy and death create the right conditions. But now it has an enemy who understands its methods, someone who has seen its true nature and survived to fight back. I may never be able to eliminate it entirely, but I can make its feeding more difficult, more costly, and perhaps, if I can find enough people willing to listen, willing to believe, willing to fight, we might eventually starve it into retreat or even destruction. The war between the living and the cosmic parasites that feed on human suffering is far from over. But for the first time in over a century, the parasites are losing ground instead of gaining it. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between battles, I can still hear the whispers of the spirits I freed from Murphy's Corner Store offering their gratitude across the dimensional divide and reminding me that no sacrifice made in service of freedom is ever truly in vain. The night shift at Murphy's Corner store may have ended, but my real work has only just begun.